Yeah, hello everyone. Is my voice audible, guys? So in last session, we were discussing about the use reducer hook, right? What is use reducer? Basically, it is one of the hook in React. And what is the purpose of this hook? The purpose of this hook is to manage the data for your component only. How we are managing our data using the hook called use state. In the same way, we can manage the data using use reducer as well. So using this hook, we are going to learn how to manage the data using use reducer hook. So how to work with this reducer means in the same way how we have worked with the use state. First, we have to import it from the React library. Once you have imported it inside your component, you have to call this reducer. You have to call this reducer. Whenever you call this reducer is going to return one array. That array contains exactly two elements, that is state and one special function called dispatch. So whenever we call use reducer, it is going to return one array. We can destructure that array because this array contains exactly two elements. The first element is variable and second element is one function called dispatch. Now this use reducer hook, nothing but this function takes two arguments. The first argument is one user defined function called reducer and another argument is like a initial data which you want to set for your state. That initial data you can pass as a second argument for your use reducer hook. So this is how we have to pass first argument our reducer function and initial state. So if you want to call this reducer function, then you can call with the help of dispatch only. So dispatch internally calls this reducer function, and this is a special function in which we are going to write the logic to update our state. So whenever you want to update your state, you have to update through reducer function only. It means in that reducer function, we have to write some logic to update our state based on the requirement. And we cannot call this reducer function directly. To call this reducer function, we have to use one more special function, that is dispatch. Now, dispatch is a predefined function which is used to call reducer function and which is used to re-render your component. And using this dispatch function, if you want, you can pass some input data to this reducer function. Using this dispatch function, we can call that reducer function, plus if we want, we can pass some input data to that reducer function also. So to pass some input to this reducer function, we have to use one special object, and the name of that object is action object. So using action object only, we can give some input data to this reducer function. So this reducer function takes one argument, and that is your action object. So action is a special object. Why we call it as a special object? Because in this object, there is one mandatory property, that is type, and whose value should be some unique string. That is the reason the name of this object has been given as an action object. This action object we can pass as an argument to dispatch function, and dispatch function will call reducer function, and it will pass this action object to the reducer function. Now reducer function will store this object in its parameter, and that function will be called. And whatever logic you will write inside that reducer function, that logic is going to get executed. So this is what we have discussed in the last session about the use reducer, and we have just seen a simple example here. So initially we are showing 100. If you click on this, then that data is getting updated to Kabir. Now here, this data 100 and Kabir, we are managing with the use reducer hook. Now let's take one more example. So this time what we will do, we will try to create one counter application. We'll try to create a counter application with use reducer hook. So for this, we will create something like this user interface. We will have a count value. Initially, we will make it 0. And let's have 3 buttons here. Increment, decrement, and reset. Reset. Here I have increment, here decrement, and here reset, or something like clear. So requirement is very simple. The moment I click on this button, this count should increase by 1. Count should increase by 1. If I click on this button, this count should decrease by 1. It should decrease by 1. If I click on clear, count should be back to 0. Count should be back to 0. So it's not like a timer. It's just a normal increment and decrement application. If I click on this button, this count should increase. If I click on this button, this count should decrease. If I click on this clear, then this count should become back to 0. So now this data we have to manage, because this data is going to change on our screen whenever we click on any kind of button. So this data, whatever we are displaying here, that data we have to manage using state concept. And this time we have to manage that state using use reducer hook. Same example we have done with use state. So you will understand the difference between use state and use reducer once I teach you how this example is going to work with the use reducer hook. So let's try. First, let's create one simple user interface like this. So for this, under this reducer folder, I will create one file called counter.jsx. Let me create a component here. I have created a counter component. So let me add here a title, counter app with use reducer hook. And let me make here count value as a 0. Right now I'm hard coding it. And I just want 3 buttons. Button 1, increase count. Button 2, decrease count. Button 3, clear. Now we can have one CSS file. Counter.cs. Counter.cs file. Now we can have here some class name, reducer counter dot reducer counter. For this, simply I will add padding 50 pixel. And let me go back to my app.jsx. Right now I will remove all this. I will simply import here counter from the reducer. And let me remove all this. And let me render only counter component here. The moment I save it and go back here we got it. Now let's add some more CSS here. dot reducer h2. I will just add margin bottom like 30 pixel. So if I save it, I got some space here. Instead of 30, let me make it 20. And dot reducer space button, in between button, I just want to add some margin right, like 20 pixel, so that you will get some space between these buttons. And if you want, we can add text align center as well. Let's see, we got here in the center. And let me add here color green. Let's see how it looks. We got here color green. Okay. So now here we have a simple design of this counter application. Now requirement is very, very simple. Requirement is if you click on increase button, count should increase by 1. If you click on decrease button, count should decrease by 1. And if you click on clear, this count should get cleared. It means this data is going to change whenever we do some kind of action. Whenever you do some kind of action, like here, we have 3 buttons. So whenever we are clicking on these buttons, it means we are doing some kind of action. Whenever we do these click actions, we want to change this data. So data that is going to change on your screen, such data should come from state. Now we have 2 ways to create a state. One is using use state hook. Another way is using use reducer hook. Already we know how to create state, how to manage state using use state. Now we are trying to understand about the use reducer. So the first step to create that state using use reducer is we have to import use reducer hook. So from React library, from this React library, we have to import use reducer hook. Once you have imported this use reducer hook, we have to call that use reducer hook inside our component on the top level. So on the top level of your component, you have to call your hook. Now, whenever you call this hook is going to return one array. So we are going to destructure that array. And in that array, exactly you will have 2 elements. The first element will be a variable, which we call as a state variable. And second element is a special function called dispatch. Special function called dispatch. So the first difference between your use state and use reducer is use state will return one array in which the second element is one setter function. Use reducer will also return one array in which the second element is one special function called dispatch. It is a special function called dispatch. There we have a setter function. Here we have a dispatch function. This is the first difference between your use state and use reducer. Second difference is use state will take only one argument, that is initial data, but use reducer takes 2 arguments. The first argument is a reducer function. So I will say here counter reducer. Some name you can give, whatever name you want to give, you can give, because this is a user defined function. We have to create this function. That's why we can give whatever name we want. But here we have to give the name dispatch only. You have to give the name dispatch. So Apnil, for this, you have to understand export and import concept. If you know the module concept, then you will understand why we are doing like this. Okay. So here we got it. Now the second argument is your initial data. Initial data, what you want to set here. So for this, right now, I just want to store one object in which I want to store one property called count whose value I want to keep as a 0. So remember, inside this state, you can store any type of data. Right now, I am storing one object in which I have a property called count whose value is 0. Now this 0 I want to extract from this state. So can you guys tell me how can I extract this 0 from this state? Here I want to use that 0. So what I have to write here?
State.count.
So simply I have to write here state.count. So the moment I write state.count, still there will be no change in the UI. Let me see if there is any issue. Yeah, because we have not created this reducer function, right? Now we have to create this reducer function. So what I will do this time, this reducer function I will create in a separate file. If you want, you can create in this file, but I will try to create this time in a separate file. So here I will create one file called counter reducer.js. See here I am creating JavaScript file because in this file I don't want to create any component. That is the reason I am creating JavaScript file. If you want to create component, then only you create JSX file, or else you can create normal JavaScript files. Now I have created one simple JavaScript file with the name counter reducer. Now inside this file or in this file, I want to create one reducer function. So the name of that function I want to give as counter reducer. So what is reducer? It is a simple function. It is a simple function. Now this function is going to take one argument, that is action object. Now this function should return some data. And one more point we have to understand here is, which I have did not taught in the last session, this reducer function takes two parameter, not one parameter, it takes two parameter. The first parameter is your state. And second parameter is your action object. So in this reducer function, you will have access of your state using this first parameter. You will have access of current state data. So how to get the access of current state data inside our reducer function means using this first parameter. In this first parameter, always the current state data will be stored. And second parameter is your object type, where we are going to store the action object, which comes from your dispatch function. And whatever data you will return from this particular function, that data will be updated again back inside your state. Whatever data you are going to return from this function, that data will be updated inside your state. That is the pattern of your use reducer hook. Whatever data you will return from this function, that data will be updated inside your state. You can return whatever data you want. For example, here I am returning right now one string. I am saying here hello. I am simply saying hello. I did not write any logic right now. Simply, whenever this function is called, this function is going to return one string called hello. So whenever you call this function is going to return one string. Now this string will be updated inside your state. It will be updated inside your state. Let's see. Now I have created this reducer function. Now this reducer function, I want to give to this use reducer function as a first argument. So what I have to do here, how can I access this function inside another file? What I have to do for this? This function is created inside the counter reducer.js file. But I want this function to be used in the counter.jsx file. So how can I use this function inside another file? What I have to do for that?
Import.
Not import, we have to export. We have to export this function from here. In how many ways we can export? In how many ways we can export functions or variables from one JavaScript file?
2 ways.
What are those 2 ways?
Default and named.
Nice.
Default and named.
We have 2 ways. That is default export we can do or named export we can do. Right now in this file, I have only one function. So I will go with the default export. Now, once I have exported, now this function I want to use in another file. Wherever I want to use, first I need to import it. So I'm importing that counter reducer here. Now, once I have imported it, now this function I can use and I can pass as an argument to my use reducer. Now, if I go back to my browser, we should get our result. Now, what I want to do, whenever I click on this button, I want here hello. I want on my screen hello. So if you want here hello, what you have to do is, whenever you click on this button, somehow you have to call this reducer function, this counter reducer function. Why we have to call? Because inside this function only, we are returning that string called hello. So right now my requirement is the moment I click on this button, first button on my screen here, I want hello. So to get here hello, we have to call this reducer function. Now the question is, how can we call this reducer function on click of this first button? On click of this first button. So any one of you, can you tell me how to call this reducer function on click of this first button?
We need to have on click method and call dispatch.
Nice. So here I can have on click event listener. So whenever click event is going to trigger on this button, I want to trigger one event handler first. Directly here we cannot call dispatch. Okay, this is not allowed. So here directly we cannot call any function. We have 2 ways. Either we have to define here a function. Inside that function, if you want, you can call whatever you want. So what I can do here is simply I will say that increase count. I will call one function called increase count. Now I don't have this function. So this function I will define here. In normal JavaScript, we directly call the function here like this. But in React, we should not call. We have to just pass the function name that should be called on click of this button. So I'm just passing the function name and that function I am defining here. Now inside this function, I want to call counter reducer function. Now we cannot call this function directly. To call this function, we have to call dispatch. So if you call dispatch, internally dispatch is going to call your counter reducer. Now, whenever you click on this button, increase count function will be called. This function will be called. Internally, this function is going to call dispatch. And internally, dispatch will call counter reducer. Now, this counter reducer function will be called. Whenever it is called, now this function is going to execute. Right now, inside this function, we don't have any code apart from return statement. So whenever this function is called, this return statement is going to execute. And whenever return statements execute, whatever you are returning, that data will be updated inside your state. So if you go back here, and if I click on this, I got here, let me see here, we did not get hello, see. Why we did not get hello? Anybody can guess why we did not get hello here?
Maybe object we need to return.
Because the simple mistake
Type parameter.
here. Here, how we are rendering the data? right now what happened, what we have done is we have created one state. Inside this, we are storing, we are one object whose in that we have a property called count value 0. This is what the state initially looks like. Now you are clicking on this button. The moment you click on this button, what you guys are doing is just to this state, you are initializing, you are assigning one string. You're assigning one string. Initially, your state looks like this. Inside your state, you have an object in which we have a property count whose value is 0. The moment you click on this button, you are assigning one string to your state. You are removing this object and you are assigning string. Now inside your state, you have a string. But inside your JSX, how you are accessing this state? You are accessing like state.count. That's why you are getting this issue. So to resolve this issue, what I will do here, instead of storing one object, I will try to store normal number here, like 0. So now, initially inside your state, the value is 0. Now you click on, whenever you click on this button, to your state, you are assigning the value string, like hello. So let's see whether it will work or not now. Now the moment I click on this, I got hello. I got hello. How we got hello here? We got this hello because of this reducer function, because from here we are returning whatever you will return, that will be updated inside your state. That is what the point you have to remember. From your reducer, whatever you will return, you can return any type of data. You don't have any kind of restriction. Whatever you will return, that will be updated inside your state. Suppose here I have object only. Let's assume that here I want to maintain object only. So here the value will be state.count. But now what I want is, the moment I click on this button here, I want hello. Here I want hello. Right now, if I click on this button, you will not get hello here. You're not getting hello, but I want here hello. So can you guys tell me what changes I have to do here? What changes I have to do here? So understand, inside your state, initially you are storing one object in which you have a property count whose value is 0. Now this state you are binding with your JSX. How you are binding? Like state.count. Now my requirement is, the moment I click on this button, I want here hello. So for this, we have to do some changes here. Some changes you have to do here. What change you need to do?
We need to return here also object type.
Nice. Here also we have to return one object. And in that object also, what should be the property? What property you should have?
Type.
No, not type. You should have same property called count only. But whose value should be? Whose value should be one string called hello. Because here you have binding your state, right? State.count. Now, if you are returning one object, see here, the simple funda is, this is your state. Inside your state, initially you are storing one object, and in which you have one property called count whose value is 0. Now, whenever you click on this button, again inside this state, we have to store one object only. And in that object, property key name should be same, that is count only. Because using this key name only, we are accessing the value, right? So if you change this key name, then again, things will not work. So, but the value should be here, hello. Value should be here. Why? Here the property key name should be count only, because here in our JSX, we are accessing this value of this state using the count key. So if you change this key, then here it will give the issue. Because inside your state, if it doesn't find the property with the key count, then it cannot access the data. Just assume that here instead of count, you just passed some other key, text. Now your state contains one object in which we have a property with the key name text. Now to access this hello, what should I do? I have to write state.text. But in our JSX, what we have written? We have written state.count. But in your object, you don't have any property called count. That is the reason it will give the issue. That's why whenever you are going to store a new object inside your state, then the key name should be saved. Key name should be saved. That's why if you come back here it should be count only. Now, if I click on this, I got hello. I got here hello. So with this example, you have to understand one thing. Whatever you will return from this function, whatever you will return from this reducer function, that data will be updated inside your state. That data will be updated inside your state. Now, my requirement is whenever I click on this button, this count should increase by 1. This count value should be increased by 1. So what changes I have to do here? What changes I have to do here? The moment I click on this button, this count should increase by 1. If I click on one time, it should be 1. Again, if I click, it should be 2. Again, if I click, it should be 3. So what changes I have to do here?
Return count plus 1.
So can you tell me code what I have to do here? Here directly I have to say count plus 1.
No, the method we have to call, right? Count.
Which method? Count method. We don't have any count method here.
No, sorry, this state traded in the count keyword, right?
State.count plus.
Yeah. So can you tell me exactly what I have to write here? Yeah, you guys are almost right, whatever you are telling, but you have to tell exactly what I have to write here. So first of all, what I should write?
Yeah, return curly brace open and
one object. Okay, you have to return object. Now in this object,
then
what
count.
property you should have?
Count.
Count. That is fixed. You should have a count property. But what should be the value here? What value you want to update?
State value.
Here what I have to write?
State.count.
State dot
State dot.
Count plus 1.
state dot 1.
No, state.count.
State.count.
We need to write logic to increase this.
Yeah. So basically what we have to do here is, here we have to get a value which should increase by 1 based on the current state value. So if your current state value is 0, then here it should be 1. If your current state value is 100, then here it should be 101. Okay, whatever current state value you have, to that you have to add 1. That value should be here. So how to get the current state value? If you have a axis of current state value, then to that you can add 1. You can simply add 1. So current state value, you will get the access using this first parameter. This first parameter will give you the access of current state data. So inside current state, right now inside this current state, we are storing one object in which we have a property called count whose value is 0. So I want first this 0. So if I can get the access of this 0, then to this 0 I can add 1. So how to access this 0 now? For that, simply I can say that state.count. So state.count means I got the access to 0. Now to this 0, I want to add 1. I want to add 1. That's it. Now if I go back here, if I click on this, I got 1. I got 1. Now again, if I click on this button, we are going to call increase count function. Increase count function will call dispatch. Dispatch will call reducer. That reducer we have defined inside another file. It means this function will be called. Whenever this function is called, inside this state, current state data will be stored. So what is current state data? Current state data is one object in which we have a property called count and whose value, current value, what is the current value?
1.
That is 1. So current value is 1 here. Now if I say state.count, I will get the access to this 1. So 1 plus 1, it will be 2. So whenever a count value is 2, on the screen it will show you 2. So let me just go and check here. If I click on this, I got 2. So if I click on this button, I got that increase count. So what we are doing here, we are returning one object only, but inside that object, just we are writing a logic to update our count value. Update our count value. Okay, now we have done this. Now second requirement is, if I click on this decrease count, this count should decrease. Whatever current value I have, it should decrease by 1. Right now, current value is 27. So if I click on this button, it should become 26. So whenever you click on this button, you want to update the state. Basically, we have to update our state. So to update our state, we have to call counter reducer function. So how to call this function? For this, we have to call dispatch. We have to call dispatch. So what I will do here, I have second button, that is decrease count. Now, whenever I click on this button, I will call a function called decrease count. So here I will define that function, const decrease count. Now, whenever I click on this second button, decrease count button, this function will be called. Inside this function, I have to call dispatch only. Why dispatch? Because dispatch only calls your reducer function, and reducer function only can update your state. Right now, in my state, the count value is 27. I want to make that value as a 26. It means I need to update my state. To update your state, only reducer can do that. So for that, I have to call reducer. To call reducer, I have to call dispatch. So that is what we are doing. Now, whenever you click on second button, this function will be called decrease count. Decrease count will call dispatch, and dispatch will call your counter reducer function. And right now, state value is 27. Now, inside this function, now we have to write some logic to manage increment also and decrement also. Inside this function, now we have to write some logic to manage both increment also, decrement also. If I click on first button, then there should be increment. If I click on second button, there should be decrement. Whether you are doing increment or decrement, both you guys are doing, both these actions we are doing by updating or modifying our state. Now, we have to handle both this situation inside this reducer function only. Now this reducer function should decide whether state should be incremented or state should be decremented. Your state should be incremented or state should be decremented. So let's assume that here we have now two objects. So here I will create one object. This is for increment. This is the object for decrement. Now here we have to pass any one object. Either you have to pass this object or you have to pass this object. Because whatever object you will pass, that object gets updated. Now, if you click on first button, then you have to pass this object. If you click on second button, somehow you have to pass this object. So how to handle multiple actions inside the reducer function? If you want to handle only one action, then you can directly pass that object here. But now you have two actions which need to be handled. Now we don't know user will click on which button. He can click on increment or he can click on decrement. But we have to handle both these situations. You have to handle both these situations. Now this is where your action object comes into picture. This is where your action object comes into picture. Now what you can do, whenever you are calling dispatch, you can pass one action object. This action object will tell reducer what kind of operation need to be performed on this state. Using this action object, reducer function can decide what kind of action need to be performed on this state. How? Let's try to understand. So what is action object? Action object is a special object which contains one mandatory property, that is type, whose value should be some string and which should be unique value. So for first dispatch, I am passing one action object and whose value I am passing as a INC, like increment. You can pass whatever you want, but it should be unique string. For second function also we are calling dispatch. Here also I am passing type property with the value one string called decrement. Now whether you call this dispatch or you call this dispatch, both the dispatch is going to call reducer function only. And whatever action object you are passing, that object will go and store inside this second parameter. Whatever action object you are passing, that object will come and get stored inside this second parameter. Now using this, I can write some condition here. I can use selection statement. If here I will say else. Here simply I am writing if action dot type. Action dot type is equals to INC. If action dot type is equals to INC, in that case, what you have to do? In that case, what you have to do?
Count equal to state dot count plus one.
Inside that case, what I will do, I will access this state. To this state, I will assign a new object. In that object, I will add one property called count, whose value should be one incremented value based on current state value. So current state value I will access using state.count only, and to that I will add 1. And same thing I will do for this in the else part also. But here I will make it minus. And this state again I will return back. I will return back. So what I'm doing, I'm taking current state, nothing but I'm accessing this parameter. To this parameter, I am assigning a new object. In that object, I am taking a count property, and to that count property, I am accessing the current state value, and to that I am adding 1. And here, for the same state, I will assign one more object. To that, I will assign one count property. To that count property, first here, I will access the current state value, and to that I will do -1. And same state I will return from here. Now, let me refresh it. Now, whenever I click on this increase count, whenever I click on this button, this increase count button will call this dispatch function. And here we are passing one action object and whose value is type inc. Now, this action object will be stored inside your reducer function's second parameter. And this function will be called. Whenever this function is called, whenever reducer function is called, this line will execute. It will check this condition. Action.type is equals to inc or not. This condition became true. The moment this condition became true, to this parameter, already inside this parameter, current state value is there. That is count is 0. Now to this parameter, I am assigning a new object, and in which I am assigning one property called count, and whose value I am assigning as state.count, nothing but state.count, the current value. To that current value, I am adding 1, and whatever result I will get, that value I am assigning as a value to this count property. Now, once if gets executed, else will not get executed. So once this block gets executed, then it will execute this return statement. So what we are doing here, we are returning this state. So what is the current state value? Current state value is this object. Now this object will go and store inside your state variable. And whatever data you have, that data will be shown on the screen. That is what. So here I got it. Now let's assume that current state value is 10. Now I will click on decrease count. The moment I click on decrease count, this function will be called. Decrease count function will be called. Here we are calling dispatch. And we are passing type value as a DEC. Now dispatch will call your reducer function. Now current state value is 10. Now your dispatch will call reducer function and it will store that action object inside this second parameter. Now this function will be called. Now this line will execute. Action.type. Right now the action.type is DEC. So DEC is not equals to INC. In that case, else block will execute. Now in else block, what we are doing, we are taking this parameter state. To that, we are assigning a new object. And inside that new object, we are adding a property called count. And whose value will be current state value. What is current state value? Current state value is 10. So simply here we are doing 10 minus 1. So result will be 9. Now this 9 we are assigning to this count property. Now this object will be updated inside your state. That's why you will see 9 here the moment I click on this button. Again, if I click like this. Here, if I click on that, it will increase. Here, it will decrease. Next one is clear. If I click on this clear, this value should be 0. Now that is your assignment. Now what you have to do here is, the moment I click on this third button, you have to make your state value as a 0. You have to make your state value as a 0. Now everybody has to try this. If you try this, if you are able to do, then only you will understand how use reducer is going to work. Now, when to go with use reducer instead of use state? Now we have two ways to work with state. One is use state and one more is use reducer. Use reducer. So when to go with use state? When to go with use reducer? This is very important interview question. They can ask you question when to go with state with use state, or when should I go with state with use reducer. Or they can ask you what is the difference between use state and use reducer. Because with both we are handling the state only, then what is the difference between them? So the first answer what we have to understand here is when to go with use state, when to go with use reducer. So let's try to understand. Whenever you are maintaining a state, on this state, if you are not performing multiple actions, if you are not performing multiple different actions, then try to maintain that state using use state. Whenever on our state, if we are not performing multiple actions, then better to go maintain that state using use state. If you are going to perform multiple operations or multiple actions on your state, in that case, better to maintain your state using use reducer. With this example, if you want to understand, suppose if I want to do only increment on my count, only I want to do increment. It means here we are doing only one action, that is increment action. In this case, you can maintain that state using use state. So whenever you want to do less actions like 1 or 2, in that case, better to maintain your state using use state. But if you are trying to do multiple operations on your state, for example, here I am doing increment also, I am doing decrement also, I am doing clear also. Maybe in future I want to do some other operations also. Maybe I want 2 more buttons. If I click on that button, value should increment by 5. If I click on another button, value should decrement by 5. So if you are doing multiple operations on your state, in that case, better to maintain your state using reducer function. So if you are performing less operation like 1 or 2, better to go with use state. If you are performing multiple operations, maybe 3 or 4 different operations or actions, in that case, better to go with reducer. That is what the advised by React. But still, if you want to manage your state using use state only, though you are performing multiple operations, for that also you guys are welcome. That is completely your choice. So we don't have any such restrictions that if you want to perform multiple operations on state, then you should not use state. We don't have any such restrictions. If you want, you can use state only. If you want to perform single operation, you can use reducer also. But just there is a recommendation, there is a advice. So if you want to follow that advice, you can follow. If you want to ignore, you can ignore. Yeah. If you have any doubts in this use reducer, let me know. Or else you can take today's type. I will push this code right now. You can go and practice. If you get any doubts while practicing or while revising, you can put that doubts on WhatsApp, or else whenever you come to next session, that is tomorrow, you can ask your doubts. If you have any doubts right now, you can ask. If you don't have doubts, you can leave. You can practice. If you get any doubts, keep a note of all those doubts and let me know in tomorrow's session. Because tomorrow we are going to start with another topic, that is redux. And we are going to encounter with this reducer action dispatch again in redux. That's why before we move towards redux, I just want everybody should be clear with use reducer hook. So if you have any doubts, you guys can clear it right now, or else you can take your time, you can practice on it, and you can, if you get any doubts, let me know in tomorrow's session. Yeah, guys, if you have doubts, you can ask, or else, yeah, you guys can drop. Let's join tomorrow.